name is Jory Weintraub, and I am part of the training team of NABI/ARIS. The other two people on there are my colleagues on the training team, Janice McDonald and Megan Heitman. They are here at the conference. You might have heard me just saying that there's another session that's running concurrently with a group of people that you're actually going to be hearing about in my presentation. And we're thinking of developing a collaboration with those folks, so we thought it was important that at least some of our training team was at their session. So I'm the lucky one who gets to be here with you today. And Megan and Janice are at the other session right now, but make sure if you see them over the next few days, introduce yourself and say hello, because the three of us together make up the training team. There's something else I was going to say before we got started. Oh, this is sort of just, I wanted to give this heads up right now at the very beginning, just so we're clear. The session is called Broader Impacts 101, and as the name implies, this is meant to be a very general overview, the 30,000 foot view. We've done this every year at the summit, and the idea is for people who are maybe first timers at the summit. How many of you, this is your first summit? Awesome. Or for people maybe who've been to a summit before but are still sort of getting their toes wet with broader impacts or just want a refresher course. That's what this is about. So I'm going to be going over very basic stuff. There's no assumption in this session that any of you have a lot of experience or even a bit of experience with BI yet. So if you're here to learn from ground zero, then this is the place to be. We try to communicate that every year, and at last year's summit we had a bunch of people who've been doing BI for years who came to our BI 101, and then their evaluations were, this was way too basic and you covered all stuff I do already, and we were like, well, we tried to make it clear that that's what this was. So hopefully I have made it very clear now that this is going to be the intro class, and we're delighted to have you all, especially because I think a lot of you are new to the summit and maybe new to BI. Please feel free to stop me and ask questions at any point. The old adage about there's no question that's a dumb question definitely holds here. So, if you have a question about something, or I go too quickly, or I'm not clear about something, odds are really good that half the room has the same question. So definitely, please feel free to stop me at any point. Okay, so having said that, as I said, my name's Jory Weintraub. My standard joke that I always say at the beginning of every talk when I introduce myself is that as a bald man, I wear a lot of hats, and that certainly is true in my professional life. So the hat I'm wearing today is as training director for NABI and ARIS, and I'm looking forward to when we can just say ARIS, but we're still transitioning. So I'm the training director, along with Janice and Megan. The three of us are the training team. All three of us are also members of the NABI steering committee and the ARIS leadership committee. The other hats I wear are as a faculty member at Duke University, where I am the science communication director with a group called the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. And so my main job there is to teach science communication courses for grad students and undergrads, and also to do science communication training for faculty and postdocs. And increasingly I'm doing science communication training outside of Duke, traveling to other institutions to do that. And the more I do broader impacts and the more I do science communication, the more I start to really feel that these things are not disconnected at all. And in fact, if you were at last year's summit, I did a talk, I ran a session there called SciComm and BI, two sides of the same coin. And I'm really increasingly thinking about broader impacts really as sort of the application of science communication. So it's about communicating effectively what you're doing to the world, not what you're doing to the world, but communicating to the world what you're doing with your research and how it impacts them. And so I really do try to have my science communication background and training inform my broader impacts training and vice versa. And then another hat I wear at Duke is I run the Duke Broader Impacts Resource Center, which is a small office, an office of one. It's literally my office, my little teeny office, where I do consulting on BI and help people at Duke who are writing proposals develop their BI ideas. So that's sort of my resume in a nutshell. My little slide advancer thing isn't working, so I'm gonna have to do this old school. So yeah, with that, I will just jump in. I had no idea how many people to expect, And then when I saw that this talk was originally scheduled for that room we were all just in, and then I saw how many hands went up when people said this was their first summit, I thought, holy cow, if there are 150 people in this session, the who are you part is going to take a little while. So, but even with this number of people, I'm delighted that we have a good turnout. I don't think we want to take up enough time to have everyone do an introduction. There will be lots of chances over the next 3 days for us to get to know each other. But I do want to get some sense of who my audience is. So let's just ask a few sort of raise your hand questions, okay? I know we just did that with Susan, but we're going to do a little bit more, so humor me, please. So raise your hand if you are a faculty member. Okay, a few. Raise your hand if you are not a faculty member, but you do research as your STEM research or any kind of research as your primary occupation. Okay, sorta. Raise your hand if you would consider yourself a research development person. Okay, a few. How about would anybody here describe themselves as a broader impacts professional or someone who does broader impacts most of the time? Okay. Any students in the room? Awesome. Grad students? Undergrads? Okay. Postdocs? One postdoc. What am I forgetting?
Informal education centers?
Thank you. Informal science education centers. Who represents those? Great. So we have like 4 or 5 hands up for every question, which means we have a very diverse group, which is wonderful. So, did I not call out a group and someone here feels like they haven't had a chance to raise their hand and they're dying to let us know who they are and where they're from?
There would be others. I would say an outreach and engagement specialist.
Okay, outreach and engagement.
Impact consultants, the software house.
Okay, impact consultant software.
For impact tracking.
Okay,
Measuring.
interesting. A couple other hands.
Evaluation.
Evaluation, good, thank you.
Science communicators.
Science communicators, awesome, we should talk.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So when you say broader impact, so I run an outreach program, which I like to think has strong impact,
Uh-huh.
but it's not directly because of a science research grant.
Okay.
And I'm unclear about, especially with the name change, is broader impact only the impact of research connected to community, or if I as a outreach person connect community to research or other STEM, is that also still in that above?
All of the above,
Okay.
yeah. So it brings up a really good point, which Susan, if you were just in her talk, she touched on this really briefly, which is NABI is the National Alliance for Broader Impacts, right? And as we're going to see in just a second, broader impacts is a term that is very specifically associated with the National Science Foundation, as most of us know, right? The new group, the new center is called ARIS, Advancing Research Impacts in Society. We were very deliberate when we wrote the grant and came up with a name for the center that we didn't want to call it ABIS, partly because that doesn't sound as good as ARIS, but also Advancing Broader Impacts in Society really would send the message that we are there to serve people who are working on NSF grants. And with ARIS, we definitely want to do more than just support people who are working on NSF grants. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as I jump into some of this. But for now, what I'll just say is that ARIS in particular really wants to have a broader umbrella than that and wants to be inclusive and supportive of not just even STEM, but as Susan mentioned, research in any capacity, arts, humanities, anyone who's doing any sort of research should be thinking about how that research doesn't just advance themselves and their discipline, but affects society. And so that's really taking a big step back. That's what we want to do with ARIS. Thank you for the questions. Wonderful. This is great when I get questions before I even get into the presentation. So tells me it's going to be an interactive session, which is what I love. All right. What are our objectives for this session? Briefly, gain a better understanding through theory and practice of how to develop, implement, and assess BI activities. Again, we can sort of think of BI and RI, research impacts, interchangeably, but because this is the NABI meeting and because this is the session for people who are sort of new to broader impacts, the focus tends to be a little bit on broader impacts in this particular session. But really everything I'm saying, other than the NSF specific stuff, applies to research impacts broadly. So gain a better understanding of what we mean by broader impacts and research impacts. what are these activities? How do you develop them? What are the best strategies for doing it in effective ways? Those sorts of things. Talk a little bit about where to go for resources to help you do a better job with writing broader impact statements or thinking about research impact. And then you always have to have one lofty pie in the sky goal that there's no way that an evaluation person could ever demonstrate you actually accomplished. And so that's transform your way of thinking about BI. Okay, and what I mean, I have this very sophisticated graphic here, which thinks about all of this on sort of a spectrum, broader impacts, research impacts, where historically a lot of people viewed broader impacts, the NSF broader impacts criterion, as a burden, right? It's something that you have to do if you want to get an NSF grant. I'm a researcher, I'm a biologist, I'm a chemist, I'm an engineer. I want to be doing my research, doing my field work, doing my bench work, and you're telling me I have to go visit some school and talk about what I do to a bunch of people that don't care. That's a burden, it's a waste of my time, but you won't give me a grant unless I sort of pay lip service to it. So I'll do the minimal amount that I have to do and check, we're done, right? That's the way it historically has been thought of, and NSF has been really trying to change that way of thinking, and NABI has been trying to play an important role in that. And we're starting to see a transition, right? So that people don't think of it necessarily so much as a burden, but still something that you have to do, a box checking activity. We have to say that we're going to visit at least this many schools, or we're going to participate in at least this many science cafes, just to make it look good, right? But so not quite a burden, but still not something that you're embracing. And what we're really trying to get you to do is to think of this as an opportunity, right? Think of broader impacts, think of research impact activities as an opportunity to really improve and enhance what you're doing with your research by making it relevant to everybody and by engaging the public, engaging other communities in the work that you're doing. So hopefully through this session and through the sessions that you attend over the next couple days and all of your future work with broader impacts and research impacts, you'll start to see that this really is a tremendous opportunity to engage the public in what you're doing with research, or what the people you support are doing with research. All right, so we're going to start with the really basic stuff. What is or what are broader impacts? Again, apologies if this is all review, but I think for this particular session, I just want to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind. So as you probably know, the National Science Foundation evaluates all of their proposals, every proposal that's submitted to them, on two criteria. One criterion is what they call intellectual merit, which is the likelihood that this proposed research will push forward our understanding in the field. Basically, the short version is that your intellectual merit is the science. You know, is the science that you're proposing in your NSF grant, is it novel, is it interesting, is it going to advance our way of thinking about the discipline? The other criterion is the broader impacts criterion, which is essentially saying what is the benefit to society? What is the relevance to society of the work that we're doing? Now, the NSF will tell you that all proposals are evaluated equally on broader impacts and intellectual merit. Anybody who's ever been on an NSF review panel, spent time at the NSF, even written an NSF grant, knows that the reality is that science, engineering, the intellectual merit is always going to trump everything. If it's not good, innovative, creative, novel science that you're proposing to do, there's no way the proposal is going to get funded. The point, though, is that it's no longer the case that just having really cool science is enough to get your proposals funded. Funding rates are going down, not just at the NSF, but everywhere. And they're starting to look more and more at broader impacts as a way to be a deciding factor and a difference maker. And in fact, from the NSF review panels I've been on and all of the conversations that we've had with NSF program directors, we hear over and over that broader impacts really is becoming a difference maker, and that when we get 30 amazing proposals and we can only fund 10 of them, we have to make our decision somehow, right? And so they are starting to look more at the broader impacts. Are we really doing innovative things that are going to communicate the benefit of the work to the public in our broader impacts? And if so, that can be the deciding factor, okay? So that's where we get this whole idea of broader impact from. What does broader impacts look like? It can look like a lot of different things, right? So top left there, it can be scientists, researchers, engineers, whoever, going into classrooms and talking to students about what it is that they do. Or it could be sort of the opposite, which is bringing students into your lab and sharing what you do and what your research is about in your lab, or taking students out into the field with you, right? It can be developing new curriculum to advance our understanding of STEM, or simply coming up with new strategies, new pedagogies to change the way that we teach STEM. A lot of it is focused on diversity in STEM and changing the demographics so that we get more diversity within STEM. It can be what we talk about as citizen science, which is getting the public involved in helping you actually do the research, going out into the field with you and helping you collect data. It can be doing things like going to a museum event or some public science outreach. And believe it or not, it can even be, does anybody know what this is? No physicists in the room? This is, I always get this wrong because I am not a physicist. I'm a biologist by training. It's the superconducting super collider, I think is what it's called.
CERN.
CERN, yes. Why am I showing that? I'm not suggesting that no matter who you are, you build a superconducting super collider as your broader impacts activity. But what this is supposed to represent is the fact that contributing to research infrastructure is actually considered a broader impact by the NSF. So if you're writing a big facilities grant to develop a new NMR facility, for example, and you want to bring in, a grant to buy a $500,000 piece of equipment, part of your plan can be one day a year I'm going to have open house at the NMR facility, and we're going to invite all the local AP biology classes from high schools around our community to come visit our lab, and we're going to teach them about NMR, and we're going to give them a tour of the facility, right? So you can take building infrastructure and turn that into a broader impacts opportunity. So the point is there's lots and lots of different ways to address the BI criterion. And it's not all what, a lot of people tend to think that broader impacts means either you go to a local high school and talk about what you do, or you do something focused on diversity. And those certainly are two great ways to address broader impacts. But as this represents, there's lots and lots of other ways to do that. The bottom line is that no matter what you're doing, sort of cynically, it's often thought as the return on investment, right? What is the return on the public's investment in funding science? That's what broader impacts sort of is viewed as by a lot of people, which is we're thinking about how
3:35.
end session at 3:35. Okay, I saw my big hand was at the bottom of my watch, and I thought I had 5 minutes, but I panicked. I have an hour and 5 minutes. Okay. So what is the return on the public's investment in supporting the research that's being done? Again, it's a little bit cynical because I don't like to think of broader impacts as simply convincing the taxpayers that their money is being well spent. But from Congress's perspective, that's kind of what it is. And so I often ask this question, why do we need a BI criterion? Or I often get asked that question, and I respond with this. Anybody know what this is? Who can tell me the story here?
The shrimp on a treadmill.
The shrimp, who said that? Yes. Can you tell us about the shrimp on a treadmill? If you can't, no, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't remember.
All right, I'll tell you the story. I do this all the time, it's okay. So this is the infamous shrimp on a treadmill story. What happened was there was an NSF-funded researcher many years ago, and the work that he did was actually looking at these particular shrimp. This is a kind of shrimp that was at one point all up and down the Pacific coast and was a really major food source. And they transitioned, there wasn't as much in the wild, so they now raise these things on sort of shrimp farms. They sort of culture them. But what they found was that the shrimp that they were raising in these containment facilities, these farms, weren't thriving, weren't doing as well as the ones they brought in from the wild. And this is a major source of food for a big chunk of the world, so there was concerns about that. And to get into the weeds with details you don't care about, it turned out there was some bacterium in the water that was causing impaired mobility in these shrimp, and they weren't moving as much when they were being raised in the farms, which meant that they didn't grow as big and they weren't as healthy. So there was actually a pretty important, not just scientific reason to study these things and their mobility, but actually something that had great societal implications, because this was an important food crop. Of course, what happened was that a senator, who shall remain nameless, who's from Oklahoma at the time, no offense to anybody who's from Oklahoma, got a hold of this and saw these pictures and said, $300,000 a year tax dollars are going to this clown so he can make a treadmill so that shrimp can get more exercise, right? And that's how the science was presented to the public. as this horrible boondoggle, this complete waste of money without any discussion of the actual science underlying it. And now what makes the story really interesting is this part of the treadmill right here, the actual treadmill, that's an inner tube from a bicycle tire, and this is a bearing from a skateboard. And the researcher that was doing this work got both of these things in his garage. I think his son was bummed because he cannibalized his son's bike and skateboard to make this treadmill. But the point is, he made this treadmill with parts he found in his garage. It cost the taxpayers $0, right? The $300,000 number that the senator was quoting was that this particular researcher had a large $300,000 grant, but of course most of that was spent on paying salaries for postdocs and stipends for grad students and all of that. Not a single taxpayer dollar went to build this thing, but that is not the narrative that was out there, right? And so this actually, going back to this idea that science communication and BI are really tightly linked, this is really a problem of science communication, right? This wasn't communicated effectively, but because of this, the public gets this message sometimes that the work that is being supported by the NSF is, frivolous or silly or meaningless or wasteful, right? And thus we have the broader impacts criterion. The NSF basically is saying, if you want money from us, i.e. from the taxpayers, to do research, then you need to be able to communicate to the taxpayers how their dollars are being well spent and how they're benefiting from it. And of course, the NIH doesn't have this requirement. And if you think about it, the reason is really because the NIH funds what?
Human medical.
Biomedical research, right? And so nobody's ever going to say, how dare you spend my tax dollars to cure cancer, right? That's not something you hear. But how dare you spend my tax dollars to give, a treadmill to shrimp is something you might hear, right? And so this is sort of the origin of the broader impacts criterion. It's about having researchers be able to communicate the relevance and the impact of their work to the public.
But I actually think I was kind of on the other end of that, because I think then, I never knew about was it Inhofe?
Yeah.
Of course it was. But I never knew about that part of it, but this came through some listserv I was on, and it was like, look at this cool video of a shrimp on a treadmill,
Yeah.
and like the video on YouTube was like got some tremendous, I think people were kind of,
Well,
like once, I think it actually kind of sparked a lot of interest in the shrimp on a treadmill.
so it's kind of a confirmation bias thing, right? The people who are inclined to think that any research is kind of cool and interesting probably saw that and were like, awesome, yeah, I want to know more about that. And the people who walk around all the time saying our government's wasting money, we're probably going to use that exact same video as evidence of exactly that, right? So, I'm preaching to the choir because if you're here, you probably care about research and think it's important, right? But remember, a lot of the world is more inclined to think, how dare you spend my tax dollars on that, So, all right. Really quickly, a timeline. I'm a history geek. I'm not going to bore you with all the history, but I do want to just point out that the broader impacts criterion actually, in 1981, the NSF talked about 4 different criteria that they used to evaluate proposals. That was sort of the point where they said we have these 4 criteria. And then in 1997, after sort of a bunch of different iterations of that, they streamlined it down to the 2 criteria that I mentioned to you, intellectual merit and broader impacts. So these 2 criteria and the broader impacts criterion as we know it now has really been around since 1997. So, we celebrated the 20th birthday a couple years ago. And so this has not been around forever, right? But if you think about it, 30, 40 years ago, the funding rates at NSF were much higher. They were not getting as many grants, first of all, and the percentage of money that was going to fund NSF was a bit higher. But it's getting tighter and tighter, and we're always hearing about cuts in research support. And so these criteria, intellectual merit and BI, have been in place really since 1997. And since then, between 1997 and now, it's more or less been a process of not really changing the criteria, but increasingly sending the message to the research community that BI does matter, right? So again, in 1997, you could write a 15-page grant, and 14 and a half pages could be the cool science you were doing. And then you could throw a paragraph in at the end that says, at the end of 3 years, I'll go visit my local high school and tell them about what I do. Check, right? That's the checkbox thing we're talking about. And so over the course of the last 20 years, NSF has been saying, no, that doesn't work anymore. We expect a well thought out plan. We expect you to put some effort and some ingenuity into this. We expect you to think about how the intellectual merit sort of coalesces and coincides with the broader impacts, how they work together. They've started to do things like ask you to actually not only do a broader impacts activity, but do assessment to demonstrate that what you're doing is actually having impact. So it's been a progressive series of steps to get to the point where BI really is becoming a difference maker.